So time then for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on Sunday's front pages, and tonight we'll be checking out the headlines with our two guests in the studio. Let's take a look at some of those front pages first. Escape to Hell, that headline from the Daily Mirror, as it details the situation in Gaza. The Observer looks at Israel's warning to those fleeing Gaza as they say the next stage is coming. Let's bring in your Sunday Telegraph, also leading with Israel's ground operation in Gaza, as in fact is the Sunday Times. Meanwhile, the Sunday Express headlines the Prime Minister's words, "We stand by Israel always," and reports on the former Labour leader joining thousands in supporting Palestinians in today's march. Former Labour leader. The Mail on Sunday focuses on today's London march, picturing two women parading with pictures of paragliders used by Hamas. Well, don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discuss them. And tonight we're joined by author and journalist Christina Patterson and barrister and futurist Andrew Eborn. Good to see you both this evening. What a stack of front pages. Misery piled on misery, Christina. And as the Observer shows there, both sides of this conflict, a horrific picture of a child being carried into hospital after an Israeli air raid in Gaza. And then next to it, an article with an interview of a teenager whose parents were killed by Hamas this time last week.
I have to say, Jonathan, in my many years of talking about the newspapers on Sky News, this has to be one of the darkest days. And it's very hard to know how to talk about any of it. I think what the Observer's done here is wise and right to have two heartbreaking stories from both sides, because what this is, above all else, is a tragedy. For the Middle East, it's a tragedy for Jews, it's a tragedy for Jews around the world. What happened in Israel a week ago, there is never, ever, ever any excuse for the abominations and terrorist acts that Hamas committed. But what is unfolding in Gaza now, and quite possibly, also in the West Bank to some extent, and quite possibly more widely across the Middle East, is a tragedy. And of course, Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course, it wants to and needs to crush Hamas. I think the question will be at what price, for how many people? And what we are seeing in every news bulletin is the price on both sides for the people in Israel living in a state of absolute terror and trauma and grief, and for the youngsters who are now having to join up in order to defend Israel, many of whom are they are all risking their lives, and some of them are likely to lose their lives. And for every person in Gaza who now risks, again, losing their life, losing their children, losing their parents, those who are fleeing under instructions from Israel from the north to the south, those who have lost relatives, and as we know, some of those fleeing have been bombed as they are fleeing. And it is just an utter, utter, utter tragedy.
Tragedy is exactly the right word, Andrew, isn't it? What's been going through your mind over the last week, a week on since this attack?
Well, the real problem we have, and we were discussing this earlier, we try to report these things without fear or favour. And the reality is that we are scared, that we don't want to put a word wrong in terms of the face of abject horror. And I think what happens, they always say the first victim, if you like, the first casualty of any war is the truth. And what we've tried to do is get to the bottom of this, shed a bit more light and less heat on the subject. But Antony Blinken, he was saying, the US Secretary of State, who was visiting Saudi Arabia, he urged restraint, because you've got on both sides, there are tragedies, there are civilians, there are people behind these headlines. And what tends to happen so often with these terrible tragedies is we get desensitised to the horror that's going on. And what happens, there's also been a lot of fake stories, sadly, where a lot of disinformation gets spread, and both sides will basically peddle that sort of misinformation. And I think you need to look at this, make sure we look at the horror that is going on, look at the human tragedy, and try to, as the US Secretary of State, urge some sort of restraint.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring in the front of the Sunday Express. Christina, how do you think the government here has handled this horror? Their headline, Prime Minister, "We stand by Israel always." A picture there of a Jewish father and his children heading to prayers.
I think Rishi Sunak has got it about right in that we absolutely do have to stand with Israel in the tragedy they have been through. And I know that many Jews in this country are feeling unsafe in a way that they have never felt before. What we saw last weekend was shades of the Holocaust, essentially. And many people now are feeling alone. Many Jews are feeling frightened, unsupported, and they are being subject to, some of them, to anti-Semitic abuse. And people get confused by the issue with Palestine and somehow think it's OK. I can't imagine how they think it's OK, but they think it's OK to attack Jews and hold individual Jewish people responsible for actions that Israel may take in a variety of contexts and may yet to take in this war. So I do think that Rishi Sunak has got it about right. But I think it is quite difficult to say when people make sort of statements about unconditional support. I think that does move into, or could potentially move into, difficult territory, because there is, at the moment, doubt. You know, some people, some aid agencies think that what's happening in Gaza is a breach of international law in relation to war, and there have been reports of white phosphorus being used, which would certainly be a breach of international law. So I think we can do and must stand with Israel at this time, but I do think that all politicians have to state very clearly, as Anthony Blinken has done, that international law has to be respected at all times.
Andrew, let's move on to the front of the Mail on Sunday. I'll be interested to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, there have been pro-Palestinian marches in central London today, a number of arrests, only about 6, I think. The Mail is saying there is hatred on Britain's streets. A picture here of 2 women with images of paragliders on their backs. How do you think, as a nation, we're dealing with this crisis? Well,
I think what's happening is it's polarising, isn't it? And I think the reality is that we have to recognise that not all Palestinians are obviously Hamas. I think, as they rightly say on the front page of the Mail, social media's nasty tribalism has transferred from screen to street, and it's personified by the full-throated rage of some protesters. I think having certain imagery put on your clothing and so on and so forth is obviously deliberately inflammatory. Putting that then on the front pages is only going to increase those sort of tensions. It is abhorrent, and we shouldn't be doing that sort of side. But at the same time, what we try and do is, if there's any way of trying to get some sort of calm and restraint so that it doesn't increase the tension, which is why we're sort of, as we touched on this in the break, how are we going to address all these horrible headlines without inflaming the situation? So I think that, as they say, it's social media's nasty tribalism. It's being accentuated by some of these reports, and I would absolutely urge restraint at the same time of questioning everything. Because so often you're using the media. They say if you read the newspapers, you may be misinformed, and if you don't read them, you're ill-informed. I think that the danger is that sometimes you're looking and trying to perpetuate your own prejudices. And that's the difficulty, isn't it?
Yeah.
From both sides. And I think what we need to do is get more, as I say, more light and less heat. Yeah,
very interesting that you say that about social media. Looking at the front of the Mirror, it's another picture of someone carrying a child. So powerful, isn't it, as an image, Christina? Escape to Hell is the simple headline. If we think we've seen some pretty awful images in the last few days, I'm afraid we're going to see more to come.
Yes, I'm afraid we are. And we were talking earlier about how, obviously, we don't get to see the worst images, but the reporters who are at what is now a frontline do see horrific things. And for us, those images are blurred out. But how you recover from seeing those images, let alone when you are related to the people who have been wounded or killed. I don't know. I think the fear always, and this has happened to some extent with the war in Ukraine already, is that we do get desensitised. The more we become exposed to these images and reports, the more normal they seem. And of course, none of it is normal. And I think, in a way, maybe we should ration our consumption of this, which is not to say that we don't engage with it. I think we absolutely should engage with it. I think it's our moral responsibility to be aware of what's happening in the world. And even though we feel helpless, most of us, it's not good enough to kind of pull up the drawbridge and pretend it's not happening. But I do also think there is a fine line between engaging with it and, you know, almost a kind of war porn. I think you can become sort of, I mean, I can't imagine how, but I think people do get sort of hooked on the rolling news out of almost a kind of thrill is not the right word, but, you know, all war reporters
I think you can become addicted, can't you, to knowing what's happening and needing to know the very next thing, when actually sometimes it's better just to you know, and I shouldn't be saying this as someone who works in television news, but sometimes it's better just to switch off.
I think it is.
And take a pause.
And I think it's also important, as we say, you're personifying the tragedy, because so often we do get anaesthetised, if you like, if you're inundated with imagery and so on and so forth. And I think this is why the Sunday Mirror's front page is so powerful, because you've got that image. It just brings it all home. And I think that's the sort of reality. And as I say, there are tragedies on both sides. There are people at the end of these stories, and that's what sometimes people forget.
Yeah. Hello again, welcome back. Part 2 of the press preview. Andrew and Christina are still with us. Let's turn our attention to the front of the Sunday Times, Andrew. Jonah Jason, 21 years old. He is studying geography at Manchester Metropolitan University.
Yeah, and this is the sad reality of this tragic story, is that people are scared. And what this is that the student hid his Star of David because he didn't want to be a target. And people are living in fear. And I think it's really, really important that we try and take the sting out of this sort of situation where people shouldn't be living in fear. I live in very close to Regent's Park, not far from Golders Green, and lots of people, some of the schools have even closed down because they're scared of repercussions or they're scared for their own safety. That has to be wrong. And I think what's happening is that the more we scream these headlines and the more people are peddling hate, if you like, on both sides, it gets very, very tricky. And I think what we need to do is try and, if it's possible, to realise that the atrocities are appalling. We need to work out that, as you said beforehand, not all Palestinians are Hamas. We need to work out that people need to respect on both sides in this sort of conversation.
Yeah, and so it's sad that this is happening on a university campus.
Yes,
you know, young
terrible.
people, who you would hope would be the future.
And this is a really heartbreaking story. And in fact, earlier this week, David Baddiel was talking, who wrote a book about anti-Semitism, and he was talking about how, in response to that story about several Jewish schools initially advising their pupils not to wear their school blazers, which have Stars of David on them, and then some of them actually closing because of safety fears. He was saying that he also had a blazer as a child that had a Star of David, and that when he was researching a film about anti-Semitism, he had been interviewing a child in a school and talking about the safety procedures that all Jewish children go through at their schools. And the child did not realise that they were not standard in all schools in the UK. He didn't realise that what he was having to go through was not the norm. And I think, as you say, Jonathan, the fact that this is happening on a university is absolutely heartbreaking. How we can have reached a point where the people who are meant to be the most highly educated in our society can say the kind of things that are talked about in this article. This student, Jonah Jason, talked about the president of Manchester University's Palestine Society, who spoke at a rally saying that she was full of pride and full of joy at what had happened with Hamas in Israel last weekend. Look, I'm not someone who wants to stamp down on free speech, but anyone who is peddling hate speech in that way really should be held responsible for what they are saying. That is utterly irresponsible. And I suspect that part of what's happening, and Andrew hinted at it earlier, which is, social media amplification of untruths. I think probably a hefty dose of all of this is ignorance, that people just don't understand. I mean, nobody fully understands the situation in the Middle East because it is an incredibly complicated situation, and history is not just the history of the last 100 years, it's a history of, more than a couple of millennia. But I think the fact that you can have undergraduates studying degrees in this country and saying that kind of thing really is very shocking. And I hope that that woman and anyone who makes statements like that, whether on marches or in university lecture theatres or anywhere else, is held to account for their words.
And you're right, it's freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. And I think realising that we should never, ever put people in fear and have debate and so on and so forth and have that on a sort of sensible thing, but people in fear and have to hide their identity or their religion because they're scared of the consequences, that has to be wrong.
Yeah. Andrew, talk me through this in the Sunday Express as well. Most people believe defence spending should be increased. We know Britain, of course, has sent some military assets, hasn't it, to the region?
Yeah, so they did a nationwide poll, and half the response, more than half, 55%, said the UK should increase defence spending to strengthen Britain's armed forces. And actually, it's not a surprising result. I think when you start having conflict and it comes to these shores, it's not surprising that people are going to turn around and say, look, what we have to do is make sure we're protected. Realisation that the world is getting more dangerous. I think that's certainly the reality. So, as I say, it's not a surprise if you were to ask people, should we be spending more to make sure we're safe, then, of course, they're going to say yes.
Yeah, General Sir Richard Barrons, who led the Joint Force Command until 2016, saying the armed forces are just too small, but if it applies itself, Britain can create an effective 21st century armed force. OK, perhaps discuss that more in the next hour. Thank you both for the moment.